TopMedTalk.
On today's TopMedTalk, we're going to speak to a doctor who's been trying to combat one of the terrible realities behind the life of a COVID-19 patient: loneliness. Today we're speaking to Dr. Ben Moor, an anesthesiologist at Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital in Plymouth in Boston. He's been comforting patients and spending time with them now he's been vaccinated. He's here to tell us more. Dr. Ben Moor, thank you for joining us. And
Hi, Nick.
Do you want to give us a bit of background here then? Because this is an interesting story.
Yeah, sure. So there are a few things that kind of got me to this point. I think the thing that kind of was deep back in my background was when I was training in England. And I became very aware of like the suffering of patients, particularly elderly patients, who didn't have visitors. And generally in hospitals, obviously people come and visit and they're in and out all the time. There's one particular patient which kind of stuck in my mind. And that was while I was a very junior doctor in England at the time. It was a patient who had really was in the last few days of life. And we were really trying to maintain their comfort until the family, their son from Australia, could come and visit. What actually happened was in the last day of this patient's life, they had a fall at night. They were agitated and climbed over the bed rails, I believe, and unfortunately fell and then were later kind of found down on the ground, but was taken back into the bed, but then died subsequently in the following hours. They actually, unfortunately, never had their son come and visit them. And I think the fact that that patient really kind of died with nobody around really impressed on me that, like, if we can't do a better job than this, we really are all just wasting our time. I mean, we have to be able to give these people something better than a lonely death. Modern medicine's wonderful and it provides many, many comforts, but ultimately, if we cannot do something in that situation, we really are failing. So anyway, fast forward to the COVID pandemic, and obviously, that situation of patients suffering and dying alone has just been multiplied up manyfold. I mean, throughout the world, there are people who are just suffering and dying alone in hospitals because visitors can't come and see them. The realization I had was that the healthcare teams are in and out of those rooms really as fast as possible in many ways. They were being exposed to the virus, even with full PPE, even with N95s. There was always this risk that you could still get COVID. Relatives were not allowed to come in. Family members were not allowed to come in because of the infection risk. So these patients really were isolated. And even with technology, FaceTime and all those other wonderful things that we now have, they were not able to have a physical presence in the room with them for any meaningful amount of time. My realization, I got vaccinated very, very early on. I was vaccinated in the first week that the vaccine was released in the US. That was in December. My realization when we went into January was that this really put me in a different position. We believed largely immune from the virus. With full PPE on, I was pretty comfortable that I was at extremely low risk in terms of contracting the virus. By trade, I'm an anesthesiologist, so I had also intubated these people with PPE even before I was vaccinated. So I was kind of familiar with and felt comfortable in that situation to some extent, but the vaccine really just changed the whole picture.
This is really interesting. So, first of all, an anesthesiologist, you took a leadership role here, from the sounds of it, and took initiative as regards something that, firstly, it has grabbed our attention in the headlines, has it not? The stories of people who have had to be, for medical reasons, isolated and then endure COVID-19 and other healthcare issues. So you explain that that's something that obviously went straight through you because of an early experience as a medical practitioner. And now, what is it? Are you encouraging as many people as possible to do this, or what's happening? What are you doing?
Yeah, so what happened was once we got into January, I mean, a week out after my second vaccination, I was on call. We do these 24-hour calls in our hospital, and honestly, there's not a lot that goes on during the day. Sometimes we would be called down to the ICU to intubate a patient, or if there's an emergency case or a labour and delivery case, we would be involved with those. But there's a lot of time, obviously, sitting around. And one Sunday, I decided to kind of wander down to the wards, to the floors, and just see what was going on the COVID floors. And of course, what greets you is this picture of closed doors. Now, in the US, we don't have these big open floors like I remember working on when I was in Derby and Nottingham. We had pretty much single or dual occupancy rooms, and with COVID, obviously single rooms, all the doors are shut, which is a very strange thing. You walk down and see no patients. I just started talking to the nurses, and I'd say, do you mind if I kind of go in, sit down, just see what's going on? And they were like, yeah, sure. You know, they're keen to see anyone. So I went in and I'd sit with patients, and I had in my head what it would be like, and I'd be kind of like, you know, I'd tell them about my kids and they tell me about their grandkids, and it'd be great. But of course, that wasn't really the reality for many, because, you know, people with COVID are pretty breathless. And honestly, the conversation is tough in that situation. So, you know, one of the first patients I saw, she wanted to watch the Hallmark channel on TV. And so, you know, it's not my kind of particular kind of show to choose to watch, but it was nice because we could sit there. I held her hand. I got her a little glass of water. Yeah, we just sat there. We watched TV together, and that was it. And I don't know. I don't know if it has value, but I just feel that there is some intrinsic value of being there, a human presence. You know, I held a hand, just bearing witness to somebody suffering, I think has a value. I don't know at what level exactly, but I think that has a value. So what I did after that was I wanted to really extend this. I thought, you know what, this is a good deal to spend time with these patients and not be at risk. So I kind of decided I needed to talk to the boss of the hospital, and I know him pretty well. He's a nice guy. And I said, look, I got this. This is just a good idea. It just has to happen. Do you mind if I send an email out to the whole hospital? And I kind of told him what the idea was. And he said, yeah, just do it. Just do it. I think it sounds good. You just got to do it. So I sent an email out to the whole of our hospital. And really the tone was, as we are getting vaccinated, we can address the loneliness of these patients. They're not seeing any family members. They're dying alone. We could do something about this. And if anyone's interested, you know, kind of casually, if you want to volunteer, you know, send me an email and we'll see what we can do. And honestly, within seconds of sending the email, I was getting replies. I mean, it was absolutely bizarre. There were people replying, you know, even people who felt that they couldn't volunteer were like, I love that. I just, you know, I had people tell me that like my email kind of brought them to tears that we got to this point. And I think part of that was just a general outpouring of people's like, you know, we've been so dominated by this virus for so long, so many months. And finally, we're kind of like turning the tables now. It's like, well, we're taking the battle back to the virus, and we're kind of doing what humanity does best, which is kind of pull together and get people through. So that's where it got to. I got lots and lots of volunteers. I think we have a very small hospital down where we are in Plymouth. I had 65 volunteers or so who, you know, would give a little bit of time here, a little bit of time there. And some people would, you know, it's always the thing. It's like these people who are doing so much and who have done so much are always the ones who kind of stand up when there's more to be done. And the only things that they would ever sort of complain to me about is that they didn't have more time to do it. I feel so bad. I wish I could do more. And I'm like, look, if you go and see one patient one time, you have more than surpassed, you know, almost everyone else in the population. So if you can do one visit, that's great. And of course they didn't. They did multiple.
What are the risks behind doing this, even for someone who has been vaccinated and is in full PPE, personal protection equipment?
Right. So I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think most practitioners, in fact, most members of society would feel that this whole pandemic has been pretty much about one's own personal perceived risk. And obviously we have rules that have been put into place to kind of prevent the spread. But a lot of it's about your own perceived risk of what your chance of getting it is. And if you did get it, what your chance of a bad outcome would be. That said, there are, you know, I think now you'd have to say that the vaccine is proving to be pretty good. Even against variants, it seems to be very effective. And it seems to be very effective in preventing bad outcomes. So although you may get it, it may be like flu, but when you get flu, you don't think, is this it? Is this the thing that carries me away? So I think there is that personal sense of security. We also insisted that all our volunteers wore full N95 gear. So the equipment that you would use if you were going in to intubate a COVID patient is kind of where we put our baseline. And we had a lot of discussions with infectious diseases and the disease control people. And we really wanted to meet or exceed what they wanted. Okay, so because the last thing I wanted was one of my volunteers to get sick. That would obviously kind of backfire on all of us. You don't want to become part of the problem. But I think with vaccination, with full PPE N95, face shield, gloves, gown, all the rest of it, you are at very low risk. And that was what they decided ultimately. Trust me, we had a lot of conversations about this. And it's not just the infection risk. That I have had more discussions with more lawyers about this than I ever care to do. So anyway, so in terms of the infection risk, I think it's extremely low. There are, as I say, a bunch of other risks. And as we got in discussion, because I was then contacted by a lot of other hospitals, and they were very keen to do something similar. And I was able to say, okay, look, this is what the issues are going to be coming down the road. These are the kinds of documentation you need to pull together to be able to make your hospital and make the risk managers and make the infectious diseases people all comfortable with this program, because it has to happen. It just has to happen. We cannot have people dying alone, suffering alone. And even if they don't die, they think they're going to die, and they're doing that alone in a hospital room. And that is just not right. So we have to find a way around it.
Are any of those resources online? Because it may be the case that practitioners who are listening to us speaking now might want to implement something similar in the institution where they work.
I would be more than welcome to share them. If anyone wants to email me, they can send an email to me. I have to be a little careful when things get into the legal zone. But yes, if anyone wants to email me or call me, I would be more than happy to talk them through it and send them the documentation that we used. I've been primed by our legal department. I have to be very careful about these things, but we always cycle back to this thing. This is the right thing to do. It becomes a binary decision. And whenever I talked to any of the regulatory people about this, it's like, what is our alternative? Our alternative is to let these people die alone. So assuming we can't do that, you need to find me an answer. And, it was I say it got pretty heated, some of those discussions, but, they came through and we came up with some compromises, and we managed to, run this. Really, it was a pilot program. We managed to run this thing, and everyone felt comfortable. We felt comfortable. The volunteers felt comfortable. The patients loved it. Families loved it. The hospital administration, they felt comfortable that A, it was a good thing, and B, that, we were suitably managing the risk.
I wonder what, if anything, you and the volunteers at your institution that have volunteered to do this have learned about the patient experience.
I mean, there were some things that I had anticipated, and there were some things I had not anticipated. First of all, I guess I'm not a kind of naturally kind of chatty person. So yeah, sometimes, Nick, you do this for a living. You kind of chat away, and you could do that, but not all of us have that gift. So we go into a room and you have to kind of put a patient at their ease and just kind of chat and say, look, I'm not here in any medical capacity, but I just want to see how you're doing. And if there's anything I can do for you, more than happy to do so. And of course, sometimes it's not that easy. I had one patient, and the nurse said, "Oh, you might want to go and see that guy." I think he was actually Portuguese, and she said, "Oh, he's not that chatty, whatever." But I walked in there and I kind of asked him where he's from, and of course we ended up in a conversation about Jose Mourinho, who he thought was great, and I kind of I'm not a fan of the guy. I'll be honest with you. I'm an Arsenal supporter. What are you going to do? So there is common ground there. We chatted away, and it passes some time. He feels that there's somebody there for him, and that's great. And some of those things are like that we learned about what the patients are looking for are great. We've had patients who are sort of stuck in the hospital system. We've had somebody who'd been, bumped up to a higher level of care at another hospital. She was kind of estranged from her family. She eventually came back to our hospital in Plymouth, and the volunteer said she sat with her for an hour, and then she called me and said that was the first conversation that lady's had for a month. People coming out, the medical care is excellent, but she hasn't talked to anyone for a month. So we were giving, I think, something to the patients, and I think that was what I wanted. I wanted to be able to give something to the patients and let them feel that there was somebody there for them. And, it breaks up the day, it breaks up the monotony. Many of them are very anxious. A lot of them are kind of claustrophobic, cooped up in these rooms for days and days and days and in weeks at a time. So that was the bit that I kind of hoped would happen. Okay, there were two things that I hadn't anticipated. The first one was the response of the families. So what I would do is I'd say to the patient, do you mind is there anyone you want me to call? And sometimes they didn't want us to do. Sometimes they'd say, oh yeah, why don't you call my daughter, let her know I'm all right or whatever. And when you make that call, that I hadn't anticipated was probably the kind of meat of this whole project. This was where the real value was, because the family drops the patient off at the emergency room. They're not allowed to come in. That may be the last they see of that person. There's a lot of anxiety about coming to the hospital because of that. They know they're not going to be able to see them. They will get a medical update from the medical team, which is, the very diligent and covers all the medical stuff. But honestly, there isn't that much to say in a medical update. A medical update is like, well, we went to, from high flow oxygen to this, or 2 liters to, whatever. I mean, there's not a lot to say on the medical update. So when one of my volunteers was able to call and say, oh, you know what, we talked about, the house that, your grandmother grew up in. And she told me that story about the dog. And of course, these small stories, these little family stories, when they hear those, they really respond to it, because it's like, hey, that's my grandmother, or that's my husband, or that is her. It's not the medical update. It's like, that's the person. That is the person that we know. And they were boring you with that same old family story that they bored us with for years. And there's something nice about that. There's something very kind of, it helps them make that contact. So that was the part of it that I think really, really helped the families. It helped the families get through. I would talk to them, and then I'd say, "Where are you?" And they'd say, "I'm in a car in the parking lot outside the hospital." And they'd say, "And I come every day. I sit here. That's the hospital room that my loved one's in, and I just sit there, and then I go home at night, and then I come back the next day, and I read, and I sit on my phone, and I call them, and I say, I think I can see somebody moving in your room." And so that was people's lives. People's lives were driving to the hospital just to sit in the parking lot, just to be near, 100 feet away from their loved one. I mean, it was absolutely tragic. So for us to be able to do something to bridge that, I think was really, really, really valuable. I mean, I think to be able to be another human, and you acknowledge the fact that I'm vaccinated, you're not, I'm part of the system, I can do this, and I'm going to do this. So that was probably the biggest extra part of this that I had not anticipated. And the last part, Nick, if you'll indulge me, was that the other part is how it affected the volunteers. And that, again, I hadn't really thought about that. I thought these people, it'll be kind of hard to find the time. And, we're only allowed to do it for legal reasons. We're only allowed to do it at the end of the day. You can't go at lunchtime. You can only go after your shift is over. So we had to be very clear with and it's hard. It's hard when people have families and, they have their own lives to be able to do that. So I was not sure what to expect, but I had multiple volunteers tell me it was the best thing they'd done. It was like, this is so important. I feel like I'm really doing something. I'm getting back control over my life, which is really for all of us has been spinning out of control. And finally, I can go in, I can do something that has a very, very positive impact. And I've had people just come in on the weekends, come in after work. It's just been unbelievable. But I think it is that it gives them something. It isn't just, them having to do it. You don't have to do it. You do it on your own time. There's no manager over you. There's nobody to tell you what to do or how long to do it. You don't have other tasks you have to get to. All you got to do is sit there and chat and, pass some time. And, it's just nice. So that I think has been the third kind of big bonus of this project.
I wonder, I can hear the voice of some of the listeners now who are listening to you talking about this, who are going to be asking data. Have you gathered much data about the success or otherwise of this? What have you got that you might be able to share with other people moving forward into the future?
Yeah, yeah, data-wise, I mean, we had 64, 65 kind of volunteers in our little group. We had very little administrative kind of ability to gather much data. We did. I mean, we've done hundreds or maybe even 1,000 hours with patients. I have some of the data. It's been very sketchy because really a lot of it was there's nobody overseeing it. Come in, there's a folder, write your name, write your time in, write your time out. So we've kind of had a little bit of data that we collected for it. But, I would say since we started the program, which was January, February, people have been visiting patients every day since then. As it happens, the numbers in our hospital literally in the last week are now so low. The number of COVID patients is so low that we just this week have sort of said, okay, well, let's hold for now. We can afford to hold. We're not kind of disbanding our program, but if the numbers start going up, we'll reactivate it. There are occasional patients who come in and then or I'll grab somebody else and we'll go and see them. But it's been amazing. I mean, I hope, we're kind of hoping that this is the product of the vaccination certainly in Massachusetts, which is pretty high. And, the social distancing we've all been doing. I mean, hoping that's really it. And maybe this is the end of, the pandemic as it is. Kind of fingers crossed on that.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Very much so. I wonder, though, it's interesting to hear about... Obviously, this was only possible once the vaccine was in place. And I wonder, were something alike to this, God forbid, to happen again in our lives, are there any lessons coming away that you've learned that may impact on how you deal with something alike to this in the future?
I think that's an excellent question. I mean, one of the hard things is that when you have a pandemic like this, when you have an infection like this, the most important thing is that you don't become part of the problem. That has always been the kind of underlying thing behind, healthcare workers. At the start of this pandemic, healthcare workers were getting sick and some were dying. I mean, there was famously the whistleblower doctor in China. I mean, the people were being exposed and dying. So it's very, very difficult to put yourself in harm's way until you're vaccinated, really, because until that point you are always at risk of getting sick, and also then just adding to the burden of a system that is already overstretched. So I mean, I think that is the grim reality of it. I think the other thing is to recognize that things change, and they've changed a lot during the course of this pandemic. When I think back to when we started this program, I can kind of remember the events. I can remember how it panned out over those weeks. But what I still try and call to mind is the emotions, the feeling that there was at that time. Because as we get more distant from it, it becomes harder to remember. It seems like a no-brainer. All the stuff that we do now seems like so obvious, but there was a point where it wasn't obvious. And I think one needs to recognize that things are changing, and that the pandemic is not the same as it was when it started, and people have changed, and the risks have changed, and as they change, we need to change our approach to it. So I think that's an important thing. And I also think there's another thing that I feel has come out of this. Certainly it's come out of me. And that is you've got to break rules. You have to. There is definitely a role for anarchy in medicine, to some kind of controlled anarchy. You have to break rules. You can't just say, well, there are laws for this. This is the way. There are rules and protocols. And you have to remember those protocols. First of all, they were written when there wasn't a pandemic. And second of all, they weren't all written by people who had the patient's best interests at heart. There are many forces at play in medicine, particularly in this country, where there's so much money running through the system, and that dictates a lot of protocols. So, you need to at some point stand up and say, this is the right thing to do for the patient. And when you say that, you will get other people around you be like, yeah, it really is. And if that is the case, then you have to do it. And whatever it takes to do it, you kind of just have to keep battling on, because if it's right, it just has to happen. The boss of my hospital, and actually the boss of the whole group who I called, they were both like, yeah, this is the right thing. There were a swathe of people under that. And, I'm sure practitioners, I worked in the NHS, I know this is true. You sometimes feel as a practitioner is that there are just armies of people who are there trying to stop you doing your job and doing your job for the best of the patient. That's what it sometimes feels like. Now, I'm sure it isn't that way, but it sometimes feels that way. And when you're in that situation, you just have to push back. I had one meeting where there was some dispute about employment practice and employment hours, employment law. The esoteric details I can't now recall. But at the end of the conversation, I was told it wasn't possible. And it's like, but that doesn't make sense, because that law was made when there wasn't a pandemic. And in case you hadn't noticed, there's this little thing that's been going around for the last year, and things are different. And I can see all these people in this Zoom conference, all zooming in from their beautiful homes. Like, you haven't been in a hospital, so you haven't seen a patient. So you need to change your paradigm. And if you need to change the law, then we'll have to get the law changed. That's the answer. The answer is not that it can't happen. The answer is we'll just change the law. I mean, and there are ways to do this. We've all been vaccinated with a drug that, it's under emergency use authorization. I mean, there are ways in which you can do all these things, and thank God it has been done that way. So, I feel quite passionately that after this pandemic, you asked if there are lessons to be learned, and Nick, there are lessons to be learned. We're all trying to get back to normal, and I understand everyone's trying to get back to normal, but there's a part of you that also has to say, there were some things about normal that weren't that good, and clearly we were never set up to deal with this kind of amount of sickness. Maybe getting back to normal, in some ways it's good, but in other ways, maybe we should try something a little better than normal, or a little different from normal, because you can't go through a pandemic. You can't turn the entire world upside down and change the entire world's economy. And then at the end of it, it's like, okay, right, well, now let's go back and do what we were doing before. It cannot work that way. So anyway, sorry, I'm ranting on at you here, but it's like there has to be some change and some good stuff that comes out of all this. Otherwise, as I said, with that guy, when I originally talked to you about, the elderly person who falls out of bed and dies. If we can't do better than that, if we can't come out of this and do something better, then what is the point, really? So anyway, that's my take. There's things we can do in our own personal practice, and the system can do to make things better.
Ben, you're not ranting. Unfortunately for you, you're being interesting. So I'm going to hold you for one last question here. Anesthesiology is obviously something that we discuss frequently here on TopMedTalk, and it sounds to me like you're a patient-focused anesthesiologist who's taking the initiative and assuming that leadership role, which we often talk about here on TopMedTalk. How important do you think it is that anesthesiologists do that, and that they actually try to direct the wider activity of the team?
You come into this with a huge amount of technical knowledge. And sometimes the anesthesiologists sort of have a reputation of kind of going into like pathologists, so they don't have to talk to patients, which I think is a myth. But I think there is an ability to be able to put somebody at their ease in a very short space of time, which is a real bonus. And I think coming in with that level of technical expertise and competence puts you in a position where you can direct things in a way that maybe other practitioners can't do as easily. But it depends how you manage yourself personally and amongst, other people in the hospital. When I was a resident at Tufts Medical Center in Boston. And in our final year, towards the end of the final year, one of the docs there, his name's Konstantin Balanov, and he was kind of a mentor of mine. But he gives this talk about how do you deal with certain situations and how will colleagues, maybe non-anesthesia colleagues, see you. And one of the examples he gives is if you're called in the middle of the night to put in an IV on somebody because whoever it was trying to do it couldn't do it. And the way the protocol works is that, you say to that person, well, if the intern couldn't do it, then the resident should try. And if the resident should try, then the fellow tries. And if the fellow can't get it in, the medical or surgical fellow can't get it in, then you call in the attending from home to come in and try. And once if they can't do it, then you come to anesthesia, and we will then go up through our protocol. And of course, that is a legitimate way of doing it. The thought process basically being that if you just go and put the IV in, you somehow diluted your value proposition of this bit of being a kind of attending anesthesiologist. Well, I don't stoop to do such things, but if you really need it, I will come. And that's one way of looking at it. And the other way to look at it is to say, well, there is a patient at the other end of this, and they're going to be stabbed, 5, 6, 7, 8 times before I turn up there. And the right thing to do is just to go and do it. And that doesn't dilute your value proposition. It shows you that you're a dependable person and you're not scared of getting your hands dirty and doing the menial tasks that have to be done because you're the best person to do it. I think if you do that and you lead by example, you become by default a leader. You demonstrate to those around you that you're dependable and you do the right thing for the patient. And as long as you're doing the right thing for the patient, people will respond to that. So that's my thing. I don't know if I quite answered your question, but I think it does bring you into a leadership role by doing those things. I think it is the natural touch point of surgery, of, ward medicine, the medical specialties, cardiology, all those things come together at that one touch point, which is that perioperative period. You're trying to get the patient up to a point where they are fit for surgery and will do well with surgery. They have the surgery, which obviously we're heavily involved with, and then on the back end, you're making that recovery. The rapid recovery from surgery is a priority. So it is a natural touch point for anesthesia, but it has to be driven from a point of what is best for the patient, not from how quickly can we push patients through the system. It's different in the NHS from how it is here, but the forces are still in place, which is, how do we get best efficiency? How do we make the revenue cycle work effectively? But it has to always come back to, and this is where the anesthesiologist comes into play, what is best for the patient in general and in this particular situation.
What an excellent conversation. Dr. Ben Moor, thank you very much for joining us, anesthesiologist at Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital in Plymouth in Boston.
TopMedTalk.
Thanks for listening to TopMedTalk. We are excited to announce the World Congress of Perioperative Medicine happening in London this year. Check it out at ebpom.org. It will take you through to our carbon-free conference center where it has the EbPom platform. You can find more information. Be sure to subscribe to TopMedTalk and EbPom at ebpom.org.